I'll just let those come down. So I don't want to talk about Kanye tonight and his Jew hatred-filled rantings on social media, nor do I want to talk about former President Trump's toxic notion of the ungrateful Jew in his clearly articulated transactional view of Jewish support. Half a dozen of you sent me a 2-minute video clip from Israeli actor and activist Noah Tishby that summarized this past week, now maybe 10 days, in anti-Jewish racism more succinctly than I think I ever could. And so here's that 1.5-minute clip. Maybe. It's coming. There we go. Up, volume.
Caught all of our attention.
Let's go back to, just go back one and back.
In terms of anti-Semitism, it's...
Here we go.
Hey, so, okay, what a week. So every time I wanted to do a video this week, something else happened, which caught all of our attention this week. Has been a head spinner in terms of anti-Semitism. It's completely out of control, so I just figured I'm going to give you a quick recap of what went down in the past couple of weeks. All right, here goes. Anti-Semitic flyers were distributed at the University of Michigan and at George Washington University. Mezuzahs were torn down at Stanford, and swastikas were found at Cornell and American University. The Wellesley College newspaper editorial board endorsed the insane mapping project, you know, the one that docks Jewish establishments, schools, and synagogues. It became public that student groups at Berkeley banned Jewish and Zionist students and speakers, and Drexel scheduled mandatory trainings on Yom Kippur, excluding Jewish faculty and students, while Cornell hosted a speaker who compared Jews to Nazis. And it's not limited to college campuses. Billboards in LA were defaced with anti-Semitic stickers that read, "Zionist Jews control America." In New York City, a synagogue security guard was slashed on Yom Kippur, and a sukkah was vandalized and urinated on. In celebrity world, the one and only Bella Hadid posted on Instagram a plea begging followers to stand up against anti-Semitism, saying if you see something, say something, a day after her father's Instagram post comparing Jews to Hitler, and while she was hanging out with notorious anti-Semite Nardine Kiswani. And Kanye West. Oh, Kanye West. He used the most cliche, non-creative, and old anti-Semitic tropes on Fox News and TMZ, and went on social media to declare DEFCON 3 on Jewish people.
I said she was succinct. She's right. It's been quite a week, and if you've been paying attention, you know that it is not Passover, by which I mean this week is not different than any other week, just like this night is not different or is different from any other night. The rise of anti-Jewish hate on the left and the right, and the relative silence and indifference of the press and the media celebrity class has been just as deafening and sadly as unsurprising. I spoke about it last week on CKNW radio, where one intrepid reporter, Eric Chapman, noticed the sound of silence as well and asked for comment. But I don't want to talk about anti-Semitism here tonight, not to this congregation or those watching online who know these facts all too well and have been on the receiving end of such hatreds for generations. As I've said many times before, Jews will not solve anti-Semitism. Only non-Jews, morally outraged with the denigration of the Jewish people, can put an end to the world's last accepted prejudice. Instead, what I want to talk about tonight is why, in spite of worries that never again might happen again, we need to take a moment to consider just how different Jews are now, how different being Jewish is now, than it was maybe ever before in our 3,000-year history as a targeted and persecuted people. You might have heard the Israeli joke, two Jews walk into a bar. One of them, citing Haaretz, the liberal Israeli newspaper, is in despair, lamenting that the latest onslaught of attacks on Israel and a consequential spike in anti-Jewish violence across Europe, the United States, and Canada. The other Jew who joins him in the bar is referencing the Iranian press and is delighted by tales of Jewish power as he reads aloud the Zionists control Washington and Wall Street and Hollywood and the global financial markets and all of the media. Ha, he says, if only we were that powerful. So let's take a moment to get some perspective. I know that we're all worried about slippery slopes and straws that break camels' backs, that if we don't respond to every instance of anti-Jewish hate, then we give license to the haters to keep on hating. and that is sound reasoning. It's sound reasoning for the non-Jewish world. But here, just among us and those watching online, we've got bigger problems than Kanye. The decline of Jewish identity among all non-Orthodox Jews around the world. Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas, each has sworn to destroy the Jewish state and the Jewish people therein, and further, they are amassing weapons to try to do that very thing. The decline of political support for Israel in the United States Congress, and the egregious anti-Israel bias of the United Nations. Assaults on Jewish students on campuses across North America, particularly I've heard recently amongst our own children at Canadian universities back east. The growing chasm between progressive, secular, and traditional Jews. Our inability to work together, pray together, gather together in common cause. And this is to say nothing of the challenges presented by outmarriage, the high cost of living an affiliated Jewish life, and a general decline in Jewish knowledge that is contributing to a generation of Jews that don't know how to be Jewish. Now, some of those problems are indeed deeply rooted in anti-Semitism, and I don't mean to minimize its incipient rise from the thin veneer of civil society where it has been barely contained for the last few decades. But even with all of those problems, there has been no better time to be a Jew in history than right now. So allow me to share 3 reasons why, even though it would appear that our demise, long anticipated and reported, appears to be close at hand, we are, in fact, as the joke tried to make clear, far more in control of our own destiny as a people than we ever have been before. Mind you, there have been a few times when, with our own destiny in our own hands, we were the cause of our own disunity and destruction. The first and second temple come to mind during those periods, but things still are better now than they ever were before, even when those temples fell. 1, the state of Israel. We have a homeland. It's easy to forget that just some 80-odd years ago, that wasn't the case. Yes, buried within former President Trump's criticism of American Jews for being ungrateful and commanding them to show him proper respect and issuing a veiled threat if they do not, is an important point at the very end of his characterization of that ungrateful Jew. He is right when he says, U.S. Jews have to get their act together and appreciate what they have in Israel before it is too late, end quote. But not because we owe it to him, which I think was his point very clearly, but because we all owe the fact that we are not facing pogroms and not facing trains and ghettos and even concentration camps, God forbid ever again. We all owe that fact because there is a state of Israel. And whether we live there, visit there, or send our prayers there, the fact that it stands means that Jews will never fall again, at least not without a fighting chance. And Jews should never take that for granted. Number 2, Jews are everywhere. And I mean that literally, and I mean it metaphorically. It used to be that we were gathered together in small, isolated, vulnerable corners of the world, in shtetls and villages, corners of the world, corners of social society. Nations that we could not live freely in, clubs that we could not belong to, universities and jobs that we could not ever hope to participate in. That is no longer the case. We have reached the highest levels of power and influence around the globe. We are just 0.2% of the world's population, just 2% of the population of the United States, or 2% of the population of Canada. But we are disproportionately overrepresented in industry, in science, in medicine, in law, academia, entertainment, everywhere it seems except professional sports, for which I blame mostly Jewish mothers. I hold them responsible, mine in particular. I'm only kidding, sort of. As the saying goes, we punch well above our weight class. So good for us and good for the future of humanity. Number 3, Judaism is evolving before our eyes. It's an often repeated colloquialism that in Chinese, the word for crisis is the same as the word for opportunity. I've been told by people that speak Chinese that that's not quite grammatically correct, but it's close enough to make the point. In the midst of all of these challenges, Jews and Jewish communities in the state of Israel are innovating and adapting and confronted with them, innovating and adapting to confront those challenges and to overcome them. Out of this crucible of internal and existential threat have come transformative ideas and initiatives. Free birthright trips to Israel, which are not free. They are paid for by a network of Jewish philanthropists that have made that a priority. Innovations in Jewish worship and music and learning that shtetl generations could not even have dreamed of. Awareness of and embrace of Jews from all backgrounds, all identities, all orientations, and those that are Jew adjacent, creating Jewish homes, raising Jewish families. Yes, Jewish identity is under threat from within and from without. But we are not cowering in a corner, eyes closed, hoping that the bad people and the bad dreams will simply go away. We are confronting these challenges from a place of power, a place of pride, and a place of possibility. Last weekend, we celebrated right here in our sanctuary Simchat Torah, in which we marked the conclusion of the annual cycle of reading the Torah and celebrated the beginning of the book of Genesis, reading the 5 books of Moses anew. We welcomed 40 new students into our religious school, in a year when we also welcomed 75 new families into our congregation, which now approaches 950 households, from a little more than 600 households 9 years ago. Tomorrow morning, we will begin the reading of the Torah all over again with Beresheit, the story of creation. And the cycle will continue as it has for generations and generations, unbroken, in spite of all attempts by others and by our own internal conflicts to the contrary. It will continue. As the brilliant scholar and teacher, the late Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, pointed out, the holiday of Simchat Torah goes completely unmentioned in the Bible or the Talmud. It was not recorded there. It began later in Babylon, in exile, after Jews had been exiled from the Holy Land in the 5th or 6th century. And from there it spread to Jews exiled and scattered to the farthest reaches of the globe. Not because rabbis said so, but by the grassroots of the Jewish people, by congregations and gatherings of Jews like ours. As Sacks reminds us, by the time Simchat Torah had spread throughout the Jewish world, Jews had lost virtually everything. Their land, their home, their freedom and independence, the temple, the priesthood, the whole sacrificial rites and order. All that had once been their source of joy was gone. The only thing that was left, writes Rabbi Sacks, was the Torah itself. All that remained was that book, that scroll. Yet those Jews, our ancestors, in the 8th and 9th century, who lacked land, who lacked political power, who lacked a shared culture, they danced and they celebrated in the face of devastation, and we have done so ever since. At this time in history, we have land, we have power, and we have a vibrant and expanding Jewish culture. We have it all, and yes, we still have anti-Semitism. It's not going away. But perhaps more assuredly than ever before, we can affirmatively say, neither are we. Neither is the Jewish people. Quoting the indomitable Barry Weiss, tomorrow we will read, as every generation has before us, those first words of Genesis. Bereshit bara Elohim, in the beginning, God said. And we will remember that our very lives were made possible by Jewish men and women who found a way to continue that cycle, to continue it unbroken, who refused, against all evidence to the contrary, who refused to give in to despair. And so should we. Shabbat Shalom.